It was a lie. It was such a lie. Why did they lie to us? What's up, guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is your first time here. Thank you for clicking on this video. If you've already been here, thank you for coming back. So today's video, grab a cup of tea, grab a cup of coffee. It's going to be a long one. Have you ever heard the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? It was a lie. It was such a lie.
It was all a lie. Guys, it was all a lie. She lied.
Why did they lie to us? This is very obviously not true. There have been countless examples of people causing themselves harm, unaliving themselves because of the words that people have said to them. Yet the victims of bullies and abusers are often told, well, it's just words. They're told that words can't really hurt you. So why is it that we continue to perpetuate this very bold-faced lie that words can't hurt? And if you are hurt by the things that people are saying, then you're too sensitive. It seems like the victims of bullies are often just told to brush off what's being done to them, but nothing ever really happens to the bully. In fact, oftentimes there are repercussions if the victim decides to stand up for themselves. It seems like abuse is just something that's expected to be taken, well, depending on the circumstance. If you're the one who's the victim of the bullying, then it seems like there are repercussions if you decide to stand up for yourself, yet nothing ever really seems to happen to the person who caused the harm. As a kid, I always thought that once I got out of school, then all of the bullying would stop, all of it would go away, but no one really prepared me for the fact that it's not just something that happens on the school playground. It's something that continues in higher academia and in the workplace as well. People like to say that bullies are losers, which can be true in certain circumstances. However, if we're being really, really honest here, a lot of them grow up to be our bosses. Can I just say that a lot of them grow to be highly successful people, and I have a few theories as to why this is. I'm going to give you 3 reasons as to why I think bullies are allowed to continue being the way that they are. Number 1, bullies are often praised for being the way that they are. So the definitions of bullying kind of vary depending on who you ask, but scholars can agree on these 3 things. 1, bullying is intended to harm, either physically, psychologically, or socially. 2, a less powerful target is often chosen as their victim. And 3, it happens over an extended period of time, so repetition. Bullies tend to have the following characteristics in common: concern with their own pleasure, the desire for power, the willingness to use and abuse people to get what they want, and most importantly, difficulty with seeing other people's perspective. Now, schools and workplaces are microcosms of society, right? So little small representations as to what happens in society as a whole. And living in a highly individualistic, capitalistic society, getting what you want by any means necessary is usually something that is celebrated. So that does include things like using and abusing people to get what you want. People often say that there is no ethical way of getting to be a billionaire. There is no such thing as an ethical billionaire. And it's true. When you look at all of the CEOs of these companies, these super, super rich individuals, they get their money by essentially exploiting the people that work for them.
She's got a point. She's an icon. She's a legend. And she is the moment.
We're taught that this is a good thing. Eventually, if we work hard enough, then we too can become these millionaires. But the fact of the matter is the chances of that happening are very, very slim. Most people end up in the same social class, the same economic class that they were born into. And it is very difficult to go from middle class to, I guess, the upper higher class, or whatever it is that you want to call it. But in order to get to the top, you are going to have to abuse people, you are going to have to use people, you are going to have to step on people to get where you are. And maybe there are some people who didn't have to do that. It's very possible that there are some people who have gotten to a higher position without using and abusing people.
That is not correct.
And if you know who they are, please let me know. But generally, in order to get to the higher places, you're going to have to do some things that are unethical. And essentially, that is seen as a good thing in society because you are doing everything in your power to get to the highest level. And unfortunately, for the victims who get stepped on in the process, well, they're kind of just told to get over it. People don't really consider how hurtful it is to be used by someone, to only be seen valuable for what you can give them rather for your value as a human being. Which brings me to my next point. Number 2, victims are punished. So victim blaming is a major issue in every instance of abuse, right? And whether it's bullying, whether it is XES abuse, whether it's physical abuse, people often tend to blame the victims rather than blaming the perpetrator themselves. Martin Lerner developed the just world hypothesis. And basically what this says is individuals have a need to believe that they live in a world where people generally get what they deserve. So this hypothesis proposes that individuals believe in a just world to explain events that happen to people. So for example, if someone is in a state of poverty, they don't have enough money, that means that they didn't work hard enough to get themselves out of poverty. Similarly, if someone is being physically abused, well, people automatically turn to the victim and say, why didn't you do X, Y, Z to prevent this from happening? Or why didn't you leave right away? Conveniently leaving out that there are certain steps that get to the point of physical abuse, which makes it harder for the victim to leave. So people do recognize that there are some unfair advantages in the world. However, the belief that individuals tend to get what they deserve enables individuals to maintain a sense of perceived control over a certain event. So in simpler terms, people tend to believe that you get what you deserve. Similarly, if a person is successful, that means they must have done something to deserve that success. We as humans, we love predictability. And whenever something doesn't fit our perceived notions of how things are supposed to be, then it crosses like a whole crisscross weird thing that goes on in our brain. This doesn't just apply to bullying, but it also applies to poverty, as I said earlier, and also race relations. Having the belief that people get what they deserve kind of shields us from the harsh realities of life. We see in movies where the good guy always overcomes the bad guy, and then the good guy is the one who's praised and gets all the glory and the honor. But real life does not work that way, unfortunately. When this belief is challenged, it becomes uncomfortable. The article by Giddens and Petter further explains that when an observer's just world becomes challenged, she or he will seek to rectify the situation by intervening to restore justice. However, if observers are unable to restore justice to the victim, the observer will respond cognitively by aligning the situation with their belief in a just world. That's interesting, isn't it? Like when justice isn't able to be served, then the brain's response is, well, the victim must have done something to deserve this injustice being done to them. Isn't that crazy? This also applies to people victims of violence as well. People often think that if you were a victim of a violent crime, then you must have engaged in some sort of behaviors that allowed this crime to happen to you. So this justification allows victims to essentially be dehumanized. So because people engage in victim blaming, essentially what this does, it allows the victim to be differentiated and deserving of their victimization. And then that leads to the perpetrator of the violence to then self-exonerate themselves, thereby allowing themselves to be excused of his or her misconduct and essentially avoiding any kind of responsibility or accountability, which allows them to further justify their behaviors. Unbelievable. Now, how does this affect the victims? Well, this causes self-derogation, which is essentially when the victim sees themselves in a negative light. It involves criticizing themselves, devaluing themselves, focusing on flaws or perceived failures, even though it might not be true. Self-derogation can seriously affect any kind of mental health, so that it can lead to depression, it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to worthlessness. And unfortunately, for many victims of bullying, the effects of self-derogation last for their entire life. It takes such a long time to develop self-esteem, to develop a sense of self-worth, learning who you can and cannot trust. Unfortunately, people think of bullying as little like childhood nonsense, things that happen when you were a kid. Kids can be mean, all these different things, but they don't focus on how continuous years of being bullied, of being put down, can affect someone into the late stages of adulthood. There are some people that never get over the things that they've heard from when they were a kid. There are people who have heard things that you will not succeed from their teacher, and they remember it all the way up until their late life. It really does mess with your self-perception, because it's almost as if you start to see yourself in the way that the bully saw you. You see yourself as a weak person. You see yourself as someone who's not worth being respected, unfortunately. And the most common question that I would ask was why? And it took a long time to come to terms that there is no answer for it, unfortunately. Sometimes these things just happen. As much as you try to be logical and fair about it, there is no logical or fair reason that you can give for treating someone that way. So, personal experience. I'm going to share with you how bullying also exists in higher academia. Now, I graduated from grad school about 6 years ago. However, that was not at the cost of my mental health. So when I started grad school, everything went as, typical school year. I was getting into learning my schedules, getting familiar with the material, kind of shifting into like student mode after taking a year off from undergrad. It took a record 3 weeks for my mental health to start deteriorating. Now, I will say that grad school is expectedly a lot more difficult than undergrad. There's a lot more expectations. There's a lot more coursework. There's very little free time. There's just a lot more to do than expected as opposed to undergrad, or in comparison to undergrad. Now, I can definitely make a longer video about this, going into like full detail about what I experienced, but to give you the abridged version of what happened, essentially, some professors can make your life a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And I will freely say that higher academia is full of bullies. Some professors may have been treated a certain way when they were in school, and then they decided to continue the cycle and treat their students the same way. I remember seeing people crying in the bathroom, crying leaving their advisor's office. Some people were having full-on mental breakdowns. It was such a difficult time, and then to throw things in with the bullying from professors, they had to sprinkle in just a little bit of racism in that as well. My grad program was maybe about 2.5 years, but by the end of it, I had some very serious mental health issues afterwards because of all the negative comments, the isolation, the negative treatment that I endured. And it definitely wasn't just me. A lot of other people in the program experienced this as well. I even remember bringing up the issues that I was having with the professor to my advisor. Her response was, her advisor in school did a very similar thing to her, but she ended up being a better clinician for it. So I just need to stick it out.
What?
I mean, maybe address the particular professor to begin with, rather than allowing them to continue this treatment of students. But for some reason in her mind, because it happened to her, it was completely justifiable to allow it to happen to other people. So before I go into my third and final point, I do want to bring up some instances on how bullying is tolerated on an institutional level. So let's look at two powerful examples, Gary Webb and Stella Liebeck. Now, Gary Webb was an investigative journalist in the 1990s who published a groundbreaking series called Dark Alliance.
In 1996, investigative journalist Gary Webb wrote a series of stories exposing the connection between the CIA and the crack cocaine that was being sold in South Central Los Angeles during the 1980s. These stories caused outrage everywhere, but the government denied the allegations, and competing news outlets claimed the series was poorly written and contained false reports. But years later, it was revealed that the information written in Gary Webb's series was true.
He exposed links between the CIA, drug trafficking, and the crack epidemic that devastated Black communities in the United States. Instead of his work being celebrated, major newspapers and government agencies turned against him. He was called a liar, he had his reputation shredded, and he was pushed out of journalism altogether for simply exposing the truth. Now, mind you, this was one man versus major news publications and pretty much the United States government. This wasn't kids teasing someone in the hallway. It was entire institutions launching a smear campaign to mock him. Essentially, this ruined his career and he had to leave his job at the newspaper that he was working for. Now, this smear campaign essentially isolated him and caused him to quit his job. I don't believe he was ever able to get another job in his field, but eventually this whole smear campaign caused him so much distress that it caused him to take his own life. Now, today, he is revered for the work that he did in exposing what the US CIA allowed to happen in Black communities. But at what cost? Gary Webb was essentially mocked and humiliated by institutions to the point where he felt that it was necessary to end his own life. And this brings me back to my earlier point where I said that bullying is defined as a power imbalance. A less powerful target, such as Mr. Webb, was targeted by a major powerful outlet. In this case, the United States CIA and news outlets. And here we have our second case of institutionalized bullying, which is Stella Liebeck.
An 81-year-old woman has been awarded $2.9 million after she sued McDonald's, claiming their coffee was too hot.
The public perception of it is Stella Liebeck won a lottery. She bought the coffee, she spilled it on herself, and now look, she's a millionaire. When, of course, the facts are much more complicated than that.
Stella Liebeck was a 79-year-old widow sitting in the passenger seat of a parked car when she was burned on February 27, 1992. She had recently quit her job as a department store clerk and moved to Albuquerque to be near her daughter.
The day that the burns happened, my mother and my nephew went through the drive-thru at McDonald's and got breakfast and coffee, and they pulled into the parking lot. And in the Ford Probe, there's slanted surfaces everywhere. There's no place to put the coffee. She put it between her knees and lifted the lid off. And in the process of doing that, spilled the coffee, and all of the hot liquid went into the sweatsuit that she was wearing and pooled in the seat.
So at the time, McDonald's was serving coffee at a temperature of 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. And prior to this incident, McDonald's had received 700 reports of people being burned by their coffee and has settled claims totaling $500,000. Now, Ms. Liebeck and her family asked McDonald's for $20,000 to settle for her medical bills. McDonald's refused to pay it and offered her about $800 and said, "You're not getting any more money from us." Now, obviously, this case got major national coverage. So, to prevent themselves from looking bad, McDonald's decided to launch a smear campaign against Stella Liebeck. Mind you, Miss Stella Liebeck was 79 years old at the time that this happened. So what exactly was the goal of this smear campaign? To make a 79-year-old woman look like a complete and total fool.
Now she claims she broke her nose on the sneeze guard at the Sizzler, bending over looking at the chickpeas. So,
ooh, my coffee was too hot. It's coffee!
McDonald's pushed the narrative that Miss Liebeck was a greedy old woman that was trying to get rich from a frivolous lawsuit. The smear campaign was incredibly successful. Successful to the point that even to this day, people still don't know the tragedies that Miss Liebeck had to go through after receiving burns from this coffee. Late night comedians, news outlets, and cartoons repeatedly mocked this old woman, and McDonald's repeatedly emphasized that she spilled the coffee on herself while downplaying the medical facts. I mean, this woman had third-degree burns on her groin area. Now, if you're someone that has a queasy stomach, I don't recommend looking up those pictures, but if you do, I just warn you right now, they're extremely graphic. I mean, this woman had to have skin grafts to repair the damage that she received from the burns from this coffee. Now, Miss Stella was ridiculed and became the poster child for frivolous lawsuits. And this case in specific actually allowed corporations to lobby for tort reform, which basically made it more difficult for people to sue big corporations when they were clearly at fault. Miss Liebeck not only had physical damage, but also had her humanity erased. She was perceived as being a silly old woman who spilled coffee on herself. Now, eventually, she did receive a bigger settlement for an undisclosed amount after the case had been brought to trial, but unfortunately, Miss Liebeck had to live in pain for the rest of her life. So this is just another example of how a regular person tried to stand up to a giant corporation, but did not have the means or capacity to fight back for herself. This brings me to my third and final point as to why bullies get away with the things that they do. And that is, a lot of them don't face repercussions for their actions. There are so many people that I can name, whether in regards to the entertainment industry and politics, social media, that have done some heinous things, that have gotten canceled, but they're still thriving, they still have careers, they're still making money, and it seems like nothing bad ever actually happens to them. People often make excuses for the people that they admire. With every single person, you will always find someone defending them tooth and nail. And this goes back to the just world hypothesis. People essentially believe that, well, the victims must have done something to cause the harm that the perpetrator did. For a lot of people, as long as they're still being entertained, that's enough for them. They don't care about what the person has done. They don't care about how many peoples that bully or abuser may have hurt. As long as they're still getting their needs met, they don't really care to punish them. And we see this at a grander scale in society as well. As long as you have certain resources, if you have enough money, if you know the right people, things can get brushed under the table, which unfortunately leaves victims in a very bad place. No one takes the time out to check and see if they're okay, to protect them from these things happening again. And unfortunately, by the time we actually hold people accountable for what they've done, they've left a path of destruction behind them. So whether it's Gary Webb, whether it's Stella Liebeck, we're being torn down by powerful newspapers, by big corporations, whether it's you who's being torn down by their boss or their teacher or someone in their school, just know that it is not your fault. It was never your fault, and it will never be your fault. Know that you have so much to offer, and know that no matter what anyone says or does to you, you are important in this world. Do not ever be afraid to stand up for yourself. Don't ever be afraid to be who you are. Don't ever be afraid to defend your right to live in peace. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a really long one, but hopefully you watched it to the end. I hope you did, but if not, that's okay too. Until next time, bye.